Hello and welcome to IBTimes TV. I'm Lianna Brinded, Senior Business Journalist for the International Business Times. Joining me now is Tessa Munt. She's a Liberal Democrat MP for Wales and is Vince Cable's Parliamentary Private Secretary for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. Hi Tessa, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
So first of all, the scope and scale of the banks mis-selling derivatives to SMEs has become enormous, and they've put some billions of pounds away in possible compensation for them. But when did it first become apparent to Parliament that there was a major issue that needed to be tackled?
I suppose it's been well over, it's a year and a half probably, when it started to get rumblings, although this may have come up before, but I think there were quite a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, who felt actually quite embarrassed about the fact they'd been caught. And there's a sense, I think, of isolation, and that's perhaps to some degree been encouraged by the banks, and they're trying to keep people separate from each other so nobody talks to anybody else. And I suppose probably it's with the establishment of Bully Banks, the organisation, that's really brought everything into sharp focus. And then there have been a number of issues raised in the press and through the financial press particularly. And I think that's probably focused everybody's minds on how big a problem this is. I went to the Bully Banks conference last October, and on the day I went, it was a Sunday, and the Sunday papers were reporting that the numbers had gone from 20-something thousand to probably 40,000. And I think that's probably not the end of it either.
Okay, and focusing on that FSA agreement with the banks, do you think the banks have actually been given too much power in the FSA agreement?
I'm not sure the banks have been given too much power, but I think perhaps the FSA might have looked at this in a more critical way. And what I'd like to see is them to be a little bit more rigorous in the conditions they set upon the banks for the way in which they deal with those who are the victims. So, for example, I've got a long letter here which I've written to one of the banks, raising, I don't know, I think it's probably 25 points of concern that have been raised by my constituents as to how they've been treated through the process. So the FSA's looked at the process, dealt with what it thought should happen, but when that process then gets subcontracted out to other organisations, for example, firms of solicitors, to do the fact-finding, then, you know, clearly we've got problems, because as soon as you delegate that responsibility, you dilute the control that the FSA might have had over the process itself.
So you've highlighted, obviously, fact finders as one of those issues that in your letter to one of these banks. However, what are the other main topics that you find particularly alarming and which you're trying to address now?
Well, I think in generality, there are points where I have some, I suppose, in terms of turnover, they might be considered to be medium or large size businesses. But actually, they are still unsophisticated in their dealings. They're not used to the vagaries of the banking system, its language, and the peculiarities of some of these interest rate swap agreements that were sold to them. So I have questions about the level at which, you know, where is the cut-off point for sophistication when somebody who is running a business is meant to be very, very aware of all of the finer points of banking language. So there's that point for a start. There are any number of businesses whom I'm aware of who are coming to a real crunch point this year where they start to have to pay back capital. Now, that may be, if things are suspended for them and the process is, you know, takes them back to where they were, it's a question of where you were before you signed the agreement. Because if you're paying £45,000, £80,000 a year more than you thought you were going to be because the interest rate has fallen and therefore the hedging has cut in, how do you measure where you would have been? If you're paying £80,000 more than you thought you would have to, what would you have done with that £80,000 in your business rather than giving it to a bank? How can we be sure that that calculation will be taken into account? So I think there are a number of issues about how people get back to where they were and get their businesses back to where they would have been if they hadn't been sold these atrocious and inappropriate products.
And how have you felt when you have spoken to one or several of the banks, how accommodating they have been when it comes to something as vital for businesses such as suspending payments on IRR?
I've had a few conversations. I've spoken to bank managers who don't understand the products that their regional offices or other people have sold. And I think, frankly, if you've been a bank manager for 10 or 20 years, dealing with business customers, if you don't understand the product that's been sold to the people who are your customers, I suspect they feel pretty dreadful. So at a local level, and I'm not talking just about Somerset, I've spoken to bank managers from across the country. But I think, it's clear that there are a number of people who are very embarrassed. I think there's a desire at certain levels in the organisations to get this right, but it is going to be fantastically expensive. And, they may have put a good deal of money aside. It's not going to be enough. I think there's a lot more needed.
And of course, Parliament and yourself are looking into a lot of these issues, and of course you're speaking with the banks and the FSA. But are there any key milestones this year that we should look towards?
I suppose from my point of view, when I went to that Bully Banks conference and we worked out it was 40,000, that really means that, well, even at the lowest levels, it means that there are 64 businesses in every single constituency across this country, in the whole of the United Kingdom. And I don't know where the 64 are in my patch. Bearing in mind that's an average. There may be many, many more. And I think what has happened is that those I know of, I've put them in touch. I've asked them if they'd like to be in touch with other people in the local area. But a lot of these businesses are not sophisticated. I have people who are farmers, I have people who are hoteliers, people who run leisure businesses, and they've been, people who run transport businesses, all sorts of moderately sized businesses, some of them very small, who are absolutely banjaxed by this particular scandal. And I think probably what we need to do is just keep working to make sure that people identify themselves to their MPs so that we can have a bigger voice, and they identify themselves to Bully Banks and get the really specialist advice that's available through certain firms of solicitors who are specialising in this kind of work. There will be other things that are coming up, but I think what we need to do is see how the FSA responds and what's going to happen as a result of perhaps this business of the fact-finding, the various pilot projects, and making sure that we get the very best results. We need to keep consulting so that we get the best results for the businesses.
Okay, and lastly, in one sentence, if you can, or in a nutshell, how would you describe the mis-selling derivatives scandal? Whether it's the worst or most expensive.
It probably isn't the worst, because I'm sure somebody somewhere could have cooked up an even more outrageously disadvantaging scheme. But at a time when clearly the banks hold all the cards, the businesses are at a pretty difficult place anyway. This is not a particularly easy time to be running a business, and when you get clobbered wholesale by scandalous abuse of the power that the banks have. And I've heard some dismal, awful stories of people who've been threatened and cajoled and, into taking these products. It's outrageous what's happened. But I don't think it's the very worst, because I'm sure someone could cook up another scheme that's just as bad or worse still.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
That was Tessa Munt, Liberal Democrat MP, and Vince Cable's Parliamentary Private Secretary for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills.